Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The History Squad. Now today's video is about Catherine Hayes and her involvement in the grisly axe murder plot against her husband. She was in fact found guilty of murdering her husband, but in those days it was called petty treason. Now you've got to understand, way back in history, in law, a man's life was considered more valuable than a woman's life. Now petty treason, I've got it written down here. It's when a master is murdered by his servant. Petty treason. A husband murdered by his wife, which is this case. And then an ecclesiastical senior murdered by his subordinate. And there's a piece here. It says, petty treason is an assault on the majesty of state, therefore more serious than ordinary murder. Do you know it was up until 1793 that a woman could be burned alive at the stake for petty treason? Poor Catherine, she will come to a fiery end. So, Catherine Hayes, born 1690 to a wayward mother just outside of Birmingham. Her maiden name was Hall, so it's Catherine Hall. Now, at the age of 15, this rather attractive, voluptuous young lady ran away from home. She has it on her toes. She makes a living as a prostitute, but is picked up by a group of army officers who persuade her to go back with them to their barracks at Ombersley in Worcestershire, where she performs favours for them and does the odd job of cleaning and that kind of thing. But when those officers are tired of her, they kick her out. Now she makes her way back to her native Warwickshire, where she causes quite a stir. But at the age of 23, things change for her. She is employed as a housemaid by a gentleman farmer by the name of Hayes. So our gentleman farmer, Mr. Hayes, had actually employed Catherine against the wishes of his wife. She'd obviously noticed something about this wayward young lady. Now, the Hayes had two sons, the oldest being John, who was very quickly seduced and fell under the spell of Catherine. They were married in secret, totally against the wishes of John's parents, but they lived on the farm. Now, poor old John, who was working very hard, could not fulfill the sexual desires of Catherine, and she very quickly began a series of affairs. The marriage deteriorates, but she manages to persuade John to move to London, 1719. Now, at this time, John's father, the gentleman father, had actually passed away and left him a sum of money. But John was a clever chap, and he made a business in London, a successful business, both as coal merchant, pawnbroker, and money lender. Now they were doing very, very well in London, and Catherine was given an allowance. She had servants, so she had a pretty good life, but she wasn't satisfied. She wanted more, and there was constant arguments. Now Catherine fell out with all of her neighbours. So this kind of leans a little bit towards what her character was really like, because she persuaded her husband to move to another neighbourhood. In fact, they moved twice. They ended up in Oxford Street. But he, being very successful, she demanding more, when it broke out into a violent argument. As a result, John reduces Catherine's allowance. She is furious, and there is fisticuffs. But things settle down, and Catherine persuades John to bring down a lodger from Worcestershire, Thomas Billings. He happens to be Catherine's son, and she now seduces him. She has an incestuous affair. Now, to cap this, another lodger is brought down. It's actually a friend of John's, Thomas Wood. And would you believe it, in no time at all, Thomas is seduced by Catherine, and she is having an affair with not only her son, but also Thomas, the other lodger. It was obvious that Catherine no longer had feelings for her husband, John Hayes, and she told her lovers, the two lodgers, don't forget that Billings was her son, of how he mistreated her, how mean he was too, and also that he was an atheist and he'd murdered two of their babies and buried one under an apple tree and the other under a pear tree. She also promised that if they could do the deed, kill him, they would have part of her, should I say, inheritance, £1,500, a considerable sum in those days. So they plot the death of John Hayes. They're going to get him drunk, and then they will kill him. And it happened on the 1st of March 1726, when the two lodgers, drinking heartily with John, persuaded him that they could outdrink him, but John says, no, I can outdrink you. Extra money was spent. I think a guinea had been spent on the amount of booze so far, and then extra was brought in, and when poor old John Hayes staggered and fell on the bed, unconscious, drunk, he was attacked. He was hit over the head with an axe. He screamed out, so he was hit again until his skull was bashed in. John Hayes, he's dead. Now, not everything went according to plan with regards to the murder. As they'd hit John over the head, he'd screamed out and his feet had thumped on the floor, awakening the lodger, the old lady who lived in the room above them, and Mrs. Springate. She came down. What's going on? What's all the noise? Why have you woken me up? Now, Catherine persuades Mrs. Springate that they were just having a drunken party and they will now be quiet. Catherine fetches a box for the body of John, but they decide that they're going to decapitate him first, dispose of the head separately, so nobody can identify, nobody can link the head to the body. The body is going to be placed in the box. Then they find that the box isn't big enough. Don't forget, these three, Catherine and the two Thomases, her lovers, are drunk. So they cut the body into four. Thomas Wood was said to be a butcher, but this is refuted later on by another story. However, they hack the body into bits, put it in the box, the head put into a bag, the bag is put into a bucket, and off the two drunken lovers go. Ha ha! They're not lovers to each other. They're Catherine's lovers, just to clarify that one. Now, what they should have done was gone further downstream, but it was the City of London. The gates were closed. They couldn't get out. So they decide they're going to just drop the head into the River Thames near Westminster. They drop it in just as the tide is coming in, not going out. The body is dumped simply in a nearby pond and will be found later on. The head will be very quickly recovered. Some watchmen saw two ruffians dump it in the river. When it's recovered, they're going to identify it. But how they identify it is absolutely amazing. So how do you identify a severed head at the beginning of the 1700s? No DNA testing, no blood grouping, no photographs that can be published in newspapers. So what you do is you get the head, stick it on a wooden spike and display it in public and say, does anybody know who this head belongs to? It was St Margaret's Church in Westminster, in their churchyard, that they displayed it, and sure enough, several people did recognise it as being the head of John Hayes. One of the men was a Mr. Ashby, a business partner of John. He immediately goes to John's lodgings and confronts Catherine. What's happened to John? Oh, he got into a terrible fight. She spins a yarn. He's had to leave the country. He's had to run. One version is that he's away on business, but actually Mr. Ashby was having none of it, and he reports the whole business. He returns to the lodgings with several constables, and as they burst in, they find Catherine in bed with Thomas Billings. Don't forget that lodger who was her son and her lover, that incestuous affair. They are immediately arrested. Now, Thomas Wood is away from town on business, but he is arrested later on. The coroner's court was convened on the 16th of April 1726, and the death of poor John Hayes was ruled as willful murder, with the prime suspects being Catherine Hayes, Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood. When the news broke of this terrible attack, this savage murder, it caused a sensation and people were waiting for the trial to begin. Interestingly, shortly after the arrest of Catherine, she was questioned by magistrates. She was taken from Newgate Prison down to the magistrates, and there was shown the head, the severed head of her husband, which had been preserved in cheap gin in a glass jar and was kept by a barber surgeon. It was presented to her and she goes, "Oh my goodness me, my poor husband. Yes, that's my husband's head." Now, to make a better identification, the head was taken out of the glass jar, whereupon Catherine grabs the head, clasps it to her bosom, and then kisses the head. But the magistrates are having none of this. Even though she is professing her innocence, they believe that she is guilty, and she is indicted for petty treason. Now, I've got the indictment here, the actual words. Catherine Hayes is indicted for petty treason in being traitorously present, comforting and maintaining the said Thomas Billings in the murder of the said John Hayes, her husband. She will now go for trial together with her two lovers. The trial took place in the April sessions of the Old Bailey from Wednesday the 20th of April to Saturday the 23rd of April 1726. This is such a sensational trial, so important, that it's presided over by the Lord Mayor of London, a recorder and several judges, as well, of course, of the jury of 12 men, trusted and true. This will be a sensation. During the trial, Catherine maintained her innocent stance. "I didn't kill them. I only held a candle. We were possessed by the devil," and even maintains that her husband was a bit of a nasty man. But she was found guilty, petty treason, and her co-conspirators, Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood, were found guilty of ordinary murder. Now, the two men will be hanged at Tyburn, and then their dead bodies will be chained and gibbeted and displayed in public until they rot. But Catherine, petty treason, will be dragged from Newgate Prison to Tyburn, about 3 miles, on a hurdle. People can throw things at her, spit at her, until she arrives. There she will be chained to a post and burned alive. On hearing this sentence, she, as well as the two Thomases, were horrified. They wanted a more lenient sentence. But because of the severity of the murder, no leniency would be shown. At the end of the April sessions at the Old Bailey in 1726, 15 individuals had been sentenced to death. Now, if you look back at that time, there were 200 crimes on the books that carried the death penalty, which for me is horrendous. But out of those 15, 4 had their sentence commuted from the death penalty to transportation. For some, it will mean certain death on the voyage. Now, before the execution can take place, they're all going to be executed on the same day. Thomas Wood dies in Newgate Prison of prison fever, typhus, basically. So that leaves 9 men who are going to be hanged, and Catherine, who is going to be burned alive. Now, a lot of the information we have about Catherine Hayes when she was in Newgate Prison comes from the ordinary James Guthrie. Now, the ordinary is in fact the prison chaplain. Ordinary comes from the fact that he was ordained, and this is the chap who will take the confessions of the condemned and in fact escort them to their place of execution and will give them their last sermon as they are executed. Now, he took the confession of Catherine Hayes, during which she tells who the father of Thomas Billings actually was. She stated that it was the gentleman farmer Hayes. Therefore, Thomas Billings killed his half-brother. This is such a sordid and twisted tale. The night before the execution, the condemned were gathered together in the prison chapel and sat around a table. In the middle of the table was a coffin draped in black cloth, and the prison ordinary will give them a sermon. He will lambast them. He will be quite severe. You see, it's a show, because the general public could pay a fee and come and watch the proceedings, and people would stare into the faces of the condemned because they wanted to see the horror on their faces. The public could even pay a turnkey to go and peek through the opening of the door of the condemned cells. This shows you what people were like in those days. The execution took place on the 9th of May 1726, and it's interesting the rituals that went on, bells that were rung and that kind of thing. But the condemned to be hung were taken out of their chains, and the noose and rope were placed around their neck. Now in threes they sat on a coffin on each of their wagons, with the ordinary giving his sermon. However, Catherine was fastened to what they call a hurdle, a kind of a gate, and she will be dragged through the street behind the parade of those who are going to be hanged. What happens is the wagons turn around when they arrive at Tyburn. They back up underneath the scaffold. The ropes are thrown over the top, and the horses are then whipped and they pull away, and the three men dance the Tyburn jig. So when all 9 are done, Catherine has watched them all from her hurdle. She has watched the hanging, the killing of her own son, who she must have loved dearly. Catherine is now taken from the hurdle. She must have been in a right state. She's taken to the post, where she's fastened with an iron collar around her throat and then a chain around her waist. Faggots of wood are put up against her feet, and then a noose is passed over her head and then thread through a hole in the actual post. So Arnett is going to strangle her. The fire is set, the flames leap up, she begins to shriek. The public are watching. There's a grandstand that's actually been built so people can get a good view. As Arnett picks up the rope to strangle her, the wind blows the flames against him. He drops the rope. He can't strangle her. She is screaming out loud as the flames are reaching round her legs. She's trying to kick away the faggots of wood. Arnett, in desperation now at what is happening, he throws a lump of wood against their head, and apparently this bashes out her brains. Meanwhile, the grandstand collapses. 2 people are killed. Many are injured. And I forgot to mention, 2 of the highwaymen who are going to be hanged tried to escape, but they were recaptured. Richard Arnett was not having a good day. Catherine Hayes burnt to ashes. There was nothing left at all, and her son and lover, Thomas Billings, hung in chains in a gibbet till he rotted away. She must have been quite a girl, Catherine, but she always wanted more. And when it came to the murder of her husband, she thought she could get away with it, except for one vital piece of evidence: the severed head of John Hayes. As soon as it's identified, she is done. And yet, if it had been disposed of correctly and been washed out to sea, nobody would have been any the wiser. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video, or at the very least found it interesting. If you did, like, share and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel a little further, you could join our Patreon community. The link is in the description. But before I go, a quick mention of some of our Patreon members: Peter Wilson, Alex Long, and James Tanner Godwin. Hey guys, thanks a million. Bye for now.